We are still in 1 Corinthians and still in a series that is aimed at improving and understanding our Christian character. And in the last couple of weeks, we have been looking in 1 Corinthians because we have been looking at the Pauline epistles. Those are the letters written to churches by Paul the Apostle. And we have done those in what commentators tell me is the chronological order in which those letters were sent. There's not an absolute agreement among scholars about that, but they are not in chronological order in the scriptures, or in the Bible as we have it. They're in the order of how long they are. So I will not be going into 2 Corinthians because I don't think there's any new material there for this topic. It certainly merits our study, but not for this particular topic. And then assuming I get through 4 additional points today, we will be moving into the book of Romans. And there is a year's worth of study in the book of Romans. There is some significant and deep theology, and I am not going to be focusing on that. I'm going to be focusing on what Paul has to say in the book of Romans, specifically about Christian character, how we are to be. So we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6 first, and then we're going to look into chapter 7, and then a couple others. So we'll see. I'll try to keep it relatively brief because I know the kids are not making their papier-mâché mountain and construction paper burning bushes, and so we will certainly miss the glitter on the carpet in the basement. Chapter 6, and again, as you remember the background of 1 Corinthians, the church is an amalgam of people, Jewish and Gentile, and they've been having some behavior issues. And so Paul is engaged in a series of correspondence with them. We have 2 of those letters, and he's just he's doing a lot of expressing his frustration with the church at Corinth and trying to give them good direction about how they should change their ways. Now, in verse 5, and I just want to point this out as we move into chapter 6, in chapter 5, which we explored a little bit last week, is talking about immorality within the church and the church's tolerance of that, about which they boasted. And so we go from that into a discussion about lawsuits among believers. And that chapter ends with some more moral instruction about immorality, and in particular sexual immorality. So we assume there is some significance in the fact that this little diatribe about lawsuits among believers is sandwiched in between 2 lessons on purity and morality and sexual integrity. And so we can look at these things as having a theme, and the theme is that we should be different from the world, that our standards should be different, our behavior should be different, and that we must not trust in the systems of the world. Now, let's just read this scripture and then we'll mash through it. If any of you has a dispute against another, how dare you take it to court before the unrighteous and not before the saints? And don't you know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the trivial cases? Don't you know that we will judge angels? How much more matters of this life? Now, I'm attaching a certain cadence and word emphasis and elocution to this. You can just imagine in your own mind the voice with which Paul is speaking as he writes this, and I can almost, of course, a lot of times he had a scribe, but I can almost see him wearing down the nubs of his quill as he writes this. How dare you? Can it be? So if you have such matters, do you appoint as your judges those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is not one wise person among you who is able to arbitrate between fellow believers? And you'll recall that worldly philosophical wisdom and theological debates and allegiances was part of the issue of disunity in the Corinthian church. And so this is another kind of jab. You're boasting about your wisdom, but you don't have anybody wiser than the civilian courts. Instead, brother goes against brother, and that before unbelievers. As it is to have legal disputes against one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves do wrong and cheat, and you do this to brothers and sisters. Don't you know that the unrighteous will not inherit God's kingdom? Do not be deceived. No sexually immoral people, and he gives this list. And some of you used to be like this, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. A couple of things here. First of all, it would be a misapplication of this particular passage to say we should never use the court system to sue somebody. It would also be an application to say we should never sue another person who is a Christian or who's a Christian that owns a business. And we want to be careful that when we look at this teaching, that we don't over-apply it or under-apply it. We know that throughout Paul's experience, he used his legal rights as a Roman citizen on multiple occasions. And in Romans specifically, in chapter 13, he talks about the God-given authority of government and how we should obey. And when he uses the term unrighteous about the courts, he's not necessarily saying that these judges are corrupt. Let's take a look at what we know about judicial systems in this historically Greek place that was currently under Roman rule. So the Romans are known for their highly developed legal system, and they had a high regard for the systems that they had designed as part of their Roman governance. We also know that this did not free the people in government from looking for bribes or perverting justice, because if you remember from the account of Paul in Acts, he was kept in prison for a long time because the ruler at the time was kind of hoping that Paul would get with it and offer the bribe so that he could get out. And then Paul continued to assert his rights of appeal eventually to Caesar. One thing we know about the Roman courts is, and we'll have to use your own judgment to see if this is true in today's American jurisprudence, and we get a lot from the Roman government and the Roman set of laws, although our most immediate history is British, English. is that it was a system that favored the rich and wealthy and influential. So you didn't have this situation like you have in America, where you can be born poor, scrape your way through college and law school, and end up as a state or federal judge or even on the Supreme Court. If you were born rich, then you were among the class of people that might become a tribunal by political appointment and influence. And so this social stratification of the legal system tended to be the rich got favored in decisions and the poor were looked down upon. Now, if you've ever spent any time sitting in the courtroom and watching judicial procedures, you will see that the demographic of people who are caught up in the civil and criminal justice systems is not a cross-section of demographics. In other words, there are a lot of poor people that shuffle through court. And as I was born lower middle class, upper poverty, always had a place to sleep, always had a meal to eat, but certainly not privileged. And having had the opportunity to achieve some things beyond the status that I grew up with, one thing I don't understand is the really rich. And Ellen, I think you mentioned that there's a book by Ruby Payne talks about the framework for understanding poverty, which I would recommend that all of you read. It's a very interesting application to our community, and it was an interesting application to our lives. But the truly rich, the people that really are out of touch with what it takes to live and go to the grocery store and get your car fixed and not know if your job's going to last, those folks typically have zero understanding or very little understanding of what most of us go through in our daily lives. Worrying about being sick, worrying about employment, worrying about our family, worrying about the political winds of support benefits for food and housing and those kinds of things. And so this was true in the Roman world as well. Now we also understand that the Romans left the Jews alone as a political strategy, not to cause an uprising, so that the Jews were allowed to continue their own system of justice. And the only thing, as you remember from the crucifixion story, the only thing that the Jews could not do was to impose the death sentence. That was only for the Romans to do. But everything else, the Jews could bring to their Jewish leaders. And in the Old Testament, it was the priestly system and then the judges that you'd go to for these decisions, and then the rabbinical takeover that we see expanded during the intertestamental period, that 400 period of silence for the most part. So we have the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the councils, and they would be the ones that would arbitrate disputes and put out punishment. So the Christians who had separated themselves or were separated from the Jewish community because of their acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah, were still considered a sect of Judaism, so that the Roman government would have said to these people at the Church of Corinth, because they typically were in a synagogue, that's where Paul started his church fellowships, he refers to, and it's significant, he refers to this group not as the synagogue, but as the called out, the word that we get ecclesiastics from. And it's the same word that is used for a city council or a committee meeting, the called out for a specific purpose. So Paul uses that rather than the synagogue. So the Corinthians, having been identified as part of the Jewish culture, could have had access to those Jewish councils, but the Jews, the Messianic Jews, would not be comfortable with that. The traditional Jews would not be comfortable with that, and the Gentiles would not be comfortable with that. And so they would typically have to go to these Roman courts. So what Paul's main concern is, I believe, is that there are disputes to begin with that didn't get resolved. The scripture is very clear about horizontal relationships. Matthew 18 is one of my favorite passages because it tells us the dispute resolution process. You go to the person that you have something against or vice versa. If that doesn't resolve it, you take another person with you. If that doesn't resolve it, then you bring it before the church. And again, I don't think that's on a Sunday morning. I think that's the church council or the elders or a group of trusted, wise, committed believers. And then if there's no resolution and the other person is obviously in the wrong and is unrepentant, then you have the right to say, I'm not going to associate with you anymore. And that's what Paul was advocating for this sinful relationship that was talked about in chapter 5. Now, we don't know if there was a specific... Let me ask you, in your workplace, are there any policies named after you? Most policies, from now on, it'll be the policy of ABC Company that nobody will do this. And it was never a problem until this guy did it. And then it became a policy for everybody. You guys have been in the work world, you know what I'm talking about, right? I don't know that they name it after you, but I've generated a few policies on both ends of that. So we don't know if there is a specific thing that kind of got blown out of proportion in Paul's mind. Oh, there's these two guys griping over the camel sale, and they're going to go to court and sue each other. You just shouldn't do that. I'm going to make a policy you shouldn't do that. So the issue was, why can't you solve your own problems? So it is because Paul said, you are a unique group of people. You are in the world, but you're not of the world. You should not be dragging something that could be solved within your fellowship into an ungodly fellowship. Not that they were unrighteous or wrong or corrupt or anything necessarily. That's just the terminology. There was the Jew and the Gentile and the unrighteous and the unsanctified, and that was anybody outside that hadn't accepted Christ. And we must not ignore Paul's appeal to the, here's a word for you, eschatological significance of his teaching. Eschatology being, what do we think about what's going to happen in the future? We typically think about Revelation as being the center of our eschatological theology, but it's throughout the New Testament, and you can find it in the Old Testament as well. But Paul here is saying, don't you know we're going to have a role beyond this life? We're going to have a role after the rapture. We're going to have a role in judging angels. Now, I'm not going to delve into that theology, but we're going to be given some responsibility of making judgments in a heavenly realm about things that we need to practice here and to do so in a sense of community. Now, the word community is one that has been appropriated by the feel-good people, and I don't mind being a feel-good person, but I like the vocabulary that has been around for a long time. And I tease Nate Templin, our regional director, all the time about his use of the word missional. I said, that is a made-up word. We need to be missional people. I know what you mean. You don't have to make up a new word for it. And the word community, we used to say a community, the community, our community, but now we just say, oh, you need to be in community. I like those little prefix words. And we do need to be in a community. We need to be a community. We need to live to some degree communally, or as the modern way of saying it is, we need to live in community. And that's what Paul is saying, because we're starting that way now, and we're going to live that way eternally in community. And so let's be practicing that now. To have legal disputes against one another is already a defeat for you. When I was interim pastor of a church back in Missouri, it was a church that we were attending, and I was a deacon, and the pastor left. I can't remember the sequence of things, but anyway, I ended up being a de facto interim. And there was a contractor that was a member of the church, and there was another member of the church that had that contract to do some work for them that was not satisfactory to the other church member. And they came to me saying, we would like you to arbitrate. We'd like you to talk to Steve and have him pay us the damages. And I thought, well, that's a good attempt at having a biblical approach. But I really thought that was something that really belonged in the civilian courts. Now, I may be wrong, may have been wrong about that, and I'm not sure how it got resolved. But there are mechanisms in our modern life for insurance coverage and indemnities and contracts in complex situations that probably do need to be enforced in a court of law. If you slip and fall on our sidewalks out here because somebody didn't get here early enough to clean the sidewalks off and put some salt down so that you could have some friction. And so if that's something that was regularly neglected in the management of our property, and they could prove that, and you can't always sue just because you slip and fall. It has to be a situation where the person was given actual notice or constructive notice. Like, yeah, you never clear the sidewalks. Well, if you injured yourself because of something that was our responsibility to prevent, then one might point to this passage and say, the church is made up of Christians, you're a Christian, you shouldn't sue us in court to get your hip replaced. But that is a dispute that perhaps we could be resolved, but more importantly and more practically, we have an insurance policy in place to be good stewards of those risks to our property and financial health. And so if you were to file a claim that the insurance could pay, I don't see any conflict with 1 Corinthians chapter 6 in that business arrangement. If a person is insured, and I've been in the insurance business a little bit, then that's a mechanism for resolving those disputes, and so we shouldn't be upset about that. Now, we also know that the courts in this day had the right to imprison you for debts. That's never been a great way to resolve debts, is to put the person in prison. But that was the threat. And basically your family then said, well, we've lost our breadwinner. We've got to go out and hustle or steal or borrow or sell something and pay off the debt so that we can get our loved one out of prison. So there are a lot of things that are involved in the kind of legal aspect of Paul's teaching, but the primary focus of Paul's teaching is you guys should love one another enough that you want to take care of one another. And Paul even goes so far as to say, look, if you get cheated, if you get shorted, if you get victimized, just for the sake of the kingdom, let it go. Let it go. We don't live that way in the world. We certainly don't live that way in America. I spent a little bit of time in Honduras on a military assignment, and I noticed that there were mangled cars that have rusted on the side of the road. It's not like, here where call a tow truck, get it off, sweep it, everything's back to normal, let the insurance people and the lawyers worry about it. In Honduras, you just move stuff off the road and you haggled to determine who was going to pay what to whom. It was done right there. You may or may not call the local policia. If you did, somebody would have to go into town and bring them out. And you'd probably have to bribe them on top of everything else. So you just pretty much handled it. And that was the first place I saw these crosses with flowers and stuff on the side of the road, was in Honduras. And Honduras also had a loteria. And I remember looking at that lottery ticket thinking, man, what a silly way to run the government. Well, here we are. So we do not rely on the world to resolve our differences. One of the things that really, really, really hurt Baptists in Missouri is that we had cooperative programs, not the cooperative program, but we had cooperative programs with nursing homes, with recreational camps, with what else, colleges, children's home, orphanages. So we had these wonderful ministries, and there was an effort to say, well, we're going to get our own board of trustees. We don't need the approval of the state to do this because of the Rope of Sand. That's the organization for Southern Baptists. We just try to get along. We don't have to have contracts and all that kind of stuff. And that resulted in a lawsuit against these entities that said, no, you can't have that camp on the Lake of the Ozarks. That's our camp. And they said, no, it's not. We decided on the board. And so monies to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars got tied up in lawsuits of Baptists suing Baptists over control of some of these servant entities. And I worked for a Baptist college at the time that was funded in part by the Missouri Baptist Convention. And we worried about what the future of our ministry was going to be. And I still think that those who thought that resolving those things in the civilian courts did a terrible thing because they were using donated money. They said they weren't, but they were. They were using donated money. They were embarrassing themselves to the whole population. And I'm not sure exactly what the resolution was, but I would occasionally meet with pastors, for some reason I was not at the time, who were in tears over the division and separation. In fact, I did go to a Missouri Baptist Convention one year as a representative of the college that I was working for, and they showed a slideshow about to try to explain why they were suing and what the issues were and how God was blessing that. And I just wanted to get up and yell, "Who would Jesus sue?" But instead I walked out. So that's the kind of silliness that we expose to the world when we can't resolve our own conflicts. You know, I've talked about my concern about how so many churches split over petty things or maybe significant doctrinal things. But it's such a shame and an embarrassment. And the Bible gives us plenty of tools and instruction about how to resolve conflict. And that's why I urge us to be in continued prayer. Not that I think that anybody is trying to cause trouble or trying to stir things up or trying to get rid of me, but we need to constantly pray for unity within our body so that Satan would have no victory and that the community would see us as a group of people and say how they love one another. And I want to tell you, if I have not told you lately, that I love you. I know I'm not taking that out of a country song. And you're always on my mind. But we are so blessed with our group of people. You minister in ways that are secret and sacred and heartfelt. And I know that many of you are students of the Word, which is essential, that you are willing to go above and beyond sitting in that seat on Sundays and putting a check mark by your weekly religious obligations. I know that you pray for me, not for my own sake, but for the sake of the church. And some of the things I see and I appreciate, and some things I don't see. I just know that you're out there being salt and light in the world. And my friends, that is the church. That is the church.